Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here. My name is Calvin Smiley, and I'm the author of Defund Conversations Towards Abolition. And today I have a wonderful panel with me. I have Marc Lamont Hill, who will act as kind of a moderator, as well as Olayemi Olurin, as well as Zellie Imani, who are featured in the book. Defund is a book that really looks at the kind of long movements of liberation, but really focuses on the summer 2020 through conversations with activists, system impacted folks, as well as academics, and how we can kind of bridge what we would call the gaps between reform and abolition through defund. And so through those conversations, which I thought were really important because abolition is not a monologue, but rather a dialogue, I thought bringing in some key folks with their experiences would be really important to write this book. And so I think I started this process back in 2022, reached out to folks, was really blessed and really grateful that the host of folks who answered that call sat and talked with me. And I was able to put together this monograph through these dialogues with Haymarket Books. So thank you all for being here, and I hope we have a really good conversation today. And we'll bring in everyone else. So thank you.
Yeah, man, this is such a great opportunity to be in community with people who I love to be in conversation with. Obviously, you wrote this amazing book. Ole, I get to see occasionally because she's a multimedia internet wonder at this point. And Zellie, I get to see his extraordinary work on social media mainly. I don't think we've had a chance to really build and connect in person, but because of social media, I've had the opportunity to at least, witness all the amazing stuff that he does in the community and that everyone does. And what better way to highlight a book about conversations than to be in conversation? It's such a powerful approach to this question of defunding. And so I guess my question for you is a question I always ask everybody, CJ, which is, why this book? Why now?
So, why this book? Why now? I think because we're still living through it, right? I think one of the earliest pushbacks that I got to the book when I was drafting the proposal and reaching out to folks, not the folks that are here, obviously, but just in general, was like, well, isn't that over? Isn't it kind of like dead? And, my response is, still the same, that, movements take time, social movements take time to build, and we need to massage them. We need to argue. We need to debate. We need to figure out like where we're headed with it. And, I always think back to kind of the civil rights movement. I think oftentimes when people think nostalgia about the civil rights movement is that it's often like, oh, it was here, they did everything. And when you think about it, right, if we mark it from Brown v. Board of Education in 1954 into the Voting Rights Act of 1965, that took 11 years to even get that far, right? And everything that happened in between. So, if we're thinking about defund as a social movement, we're only at year 4 in that kind of, if the clock started summer 2020. I'm not saying that folks weren't doing defund or divest prior to that, but if we use summer 2020 as kind of an anchor, and so I think that's one of the reasons. I think the other reason is that we're seeing around the country, places like Atlanta, here in New York, cop cities going up all over the place, or rather municipalities, cities trying to continue to grow the police, and we're constantly fighting against that. And we want those monies to be appropriately used in other ways, in expenditures on housing, education, healthcare. And so, abolition is a long-term haul, and I think that's why it's super important that we're still doing it right now and not just saying, oh, it's over.
So let's go there. Let's talk about what the it is, because we're in some ways committed to a kind of vision of liberation. We have a very sort of ambitious, and I would argue lucid freedom dream around the abolition movement, around defunding. But I think that's the inside baseball part of it. I think for the people watching and for the people who are going to read this book and for the people who are going to listen to the conversations that you all are engaged in, it might be helpful to say, what do we mean by defunding? And you unpack this in the introduction quite nicely. What is defunding, and where does defunding stand in relation to abolition? Are they one and the same? Is one a subset of the other? Are they competing goals? Are they complementary goals? Like, what does it mean to defund?
Yeah, so I would say that they're certainly complementary, and they build off each other. There's a synergy there that I think defund is a slogan that we saw kind of burst out in the scene in 2020 as something that people could kind of get behind and rally behind. Really showed that it could be a bridger between like reform and abolition. There's oftentimes these kind of competing, like, we just need to reform the police. And we saw that, right? I mean, if we look at from 2014, 2015, 2016, there was a lot of folks advocating we need police worn body cameras, we need bias training, we need to ban chokeholds, we need to do all these kind of reformist things. But then, 2020 was like a time where we heard people saying, nah, fuck the police, let's get rid of all of them, in a way that certainly there had been people before, but it was much louder, at least from my lens, it seemed much louder in 2020. And so for me, I look at defund as a way that it can be complementary, because it's something that both strands of people can, or both groups of people can get behind. For reformers, right, it's about lowering police budgets, right, and lowering expectations of what we're relying on police for. So it becomes a budgetary issue of moving funds from police to, say, recreation or to schools or to housing, et cetera. For abolitionists, it's clearly the genesis of where we can move to eradicate these police by continuously moving the money away from police and putting it into other parts of the community. We can eventually just make them obsolete, or as our sister Angela Davis says, our prisons obsolete, our police obsolete. And I would say that they certainly are. We certainly want to move in that direction.
Ruth Wilson Gilmore talks about different types of reforms. And one of the arguments that she makes is that there are abolitionist reforms and there are reformist reforms. Some reforms are a step toward abolition. Others are moves that trick us into believing that prisons are salvageable, that policing is a salvageable process and practice and structure. When you hear defund, I hear you saying it can be a bridge between those things. I hear some abolitionists say it's not, that it's a concession that makes people believe that if we could just take a little bit of money out of police and put it over there, we can keep the police. Others, to your point, are saying, nah, like this is a bridge. This is the germ for something. How do you think about those two competing arguments, and what do you say to the people that are worried that defunding is not an abolitionist reform but a reformist reform?
Yeah, that's a great point. I would say that we're not even worried about the reformist reform, right? We're in a moment where we're really interested in what non-reformist reformists are thinking through to kind of get us to that abolition. So yeah, I mean, I think a great example right here in New York City is the kind of closing Rikers Island and bringing 4 new jails in, right? No one wants to see 4 mini Rikers. So we want to continue to move towards not having any new jails in place. And so I would say to those folks that, I think for me, it's like, even if we're going to go with like the reformist reform argument, it's still moving money away. I mean, I at least have to be abolitionist optimistic that it's still moving money away from police, and then hoping that we can get them on board through seeing like, we don't need 40,000 cops arresting 10-year-old children trying to sell mango on a stick in New York City, right? Like, we don't need that. So we can continue to move it. I think there are people that probably are going to just stay on the sidelines regardless, but I would hope that they would at least look at this book, read this book, see the kind of visions that folks like Zellie, Olay, and others in the book have, and say, you know what, this is not some crazy pie in the sky utopian anarchist chaos dream, that they are actually bringing tangible ways in which we can bring about community, solidarity, mutual aid, and justice for folks in the community who are constantly being harassed, over-policed, incarcerated, and all the things, right?
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned those terms, particularly like mutual aid is something that comes up in your conversation with Zellie, who gives us a kind of way of thinking about this and a framework for thinking about this. And I want to get there. I want to get to Zellie and Ole in just a second. but talk before we do, just explain why you chose a dialogical format. Like you could have just written 5 essays.
Yeah. So, I certainly could have just written five essays or 5 chapters. Um, but, I'm committed to abolition, not through just theory, but through praxis. And I think seeing the work that folks like Ole, Zellie, Mike and Debbie Davis, who are in the book, Dan Berger, Marisol LeBron, Jason Perez, and Jonathan Illen, that they do in their life, I think that was something that I really wanted to spotlight and kind of also help me also think about my own abolitionist visions too. And so being able to hear from folks and have that dialogue was really important. And I thought there was precedent to this too. Marc, your book on COVID also has a similar kind of framework. Angela Davis's from Ferguson to Palestine also had a similar format where it was folks in conversation. And I really find that beautiful because the conversations, at least the way I see it, and I'm probably biased because I wrote it, but also looking at your books, is that they're readable, they're palatable to folks. People, can see it in a way that's not just real long pages and not using super academic-y words. And so I hope that this is a book that folks will be able to pick up. It hopefully won't be a super long read. And the fact that it is different chapters with different folks, there's no real order that you have to read the book, which I think is also beautiful too. So if you want to read a chapter on how a public defender in New York is an abolitionist, go read Ole's chapter. If you want to read about how an activist and a public school teacher is doing mutual aid, go read Zellie's chapter. And I think that they can all bring something different to the table, even though the through line is the same.
So let's talk to them. Let me start with our sister, Olayemi Olurin. She is a movement lawyer. She is a media host. She is an animal rights activist, and just an all around dope sister. How did you two connect, and what was it that made this conversation so valuable for each of you? Maybe I'll start with you, Ole.
I think Calvin and I have been connected on Twitter for years now. I honestly don't even know where it first began. I don't know if this is the beginning of our relationship, us having this conversation, or when. Calvin, honestly, I feel like I've known you forever now. Why I think the conversation is valuable. Especially, I think we had it like around the time, right? Like 2020, 2021, we had this conversation, I think, when we were in the thick of it. And I think people get disenchanted, I think, with social justice movements very quickly. It's the way, even like Calvin said, people had this response like, isn't defund done? Isn't it over? And there has been a lot of that, I think, since the summer of 2020. A lot of people talk about the movement as though it began in 2020 to a huge bang and then it died off, rather than 2020 being the culmination of like long-term efforts and all kind of work and representing a peak, and I think even the continued, or even like the many voices, the different kinds of voices, or this being a perspective, even if it's hotly contested or debated or criticized, the fact alone that it's on the main stage, it's on the forefront, it's something that politicians and people have to contend with or talk about, is a reflection of this movement actually growing, but more than that, but finding a sustainable footing. And I think what's nice about the conversation we had about abolition and defund is I'm somebody who sees defund as necessary as a part of the vision to abolition, right? So how I see abolition, how I always frame it to people is abolition is a vision of tomorrow, right? It's a vision of the future. Like, we are aware that they're not going to just close all the prisons and all the courts and just get rid of the system and fire all the police tomorrow, and that we don't have the infrastructure yet in place for that. But what defund kind of speaks to is that, which Angela Davis has obviously spoken to, is that America's making a policy choice. Like, America's making a decision, right? They're choosing to invest in prisons, in this this prison industrial complex and mass incarceration, and that choice has nothing to do with and does nothing for stopping crime. It does nothing for preventing or stopping crime. And in fact, it's meant to keep the same communities within that same cycle, right? So what we're saying is that instead of continuing to make that policy decision, instead of continuing to fund like mass incarceration. We should instead start defunding, taking some of that money out, which we do, by the way, to everything else. It shouldn't be a controversial or a radical position at all, right? We're defunding education and healthcare and everything else every single year, right? So we're saying instead of continuing to just bloat, like continue to overinflate police budgets while constantly complaining that you feel no safer and that crime is continuing to rise, let's start bit by bit taking some of that money out and putting that into the infrastructure of communities, right? We're funding what they need, the root causes of crime, housing, education, healthcare, and so that over time you will have divested from this mass incarceration and this criminal system, and that will lead to abolition. So I think there's something, what I think is really beautiful about the conversational nature of Calvin's book is that you get to get those explanations, right? Like all the conventional ways in which people talk about and think about abolition and defund and their different roles in the movement, to get those answers spelled out to you in a really easy and digestible way. So that's why I think this is beautiful. And I'm just honored to be a part of it. I'm really honored to get a chapter. I love it. I love it so much.
How do you, I'm sorry, is that me?
Yeah, you're good now.
Is that me? I don't know if that was me, but either way, how do you think about being a movement lawyer? And you've been a public defender. You've been somebody who operates inside the belly of the beast.
Yeah.
And if we begin from an abolitionist posture of saying that these systems themselves are not salvageable, how do you wrestle with the tensions and contradictions that might accompany working in a place that ultimately you don't want to exist?
Yeah. So I don't wrestle with it. I think I'm aware of it, but aware of it as a fact, like by having worked in the system. I think there is this, I think it's a myth, and it's also comforting for a lot of people to believe that they can change it from the inside, right? Because like to decide to play, to be firmly against the system or fight the system from the outside puts you in opposition to the system, which is a dangerous place to be in. And so it's easier to let yourself believe it's safer, like I can fight it from the inside. And I think it's necessary. I want to be clear. I think that the work I did as a public defender and the work that people do from within the system is necessary because the system is there. People they are caught up in the system. They are going to be caught up in the system, and they need to have people willing to contend and fight for them within that system, right? To do something for them between that rock and a hard place. But you are very much so between a rock and a hard place, like something that the law is already written against you. The law is against you, and it's applied against you even more. And the people that are in court, like, you have to remember that everybody, not only is everybody against you, the judge, the legislators, the prosecutor, but even the defense attorney is educated in the system that is against you and thought to believe that the system is just and the system is to be upheld. And what I realized in being a public defender is like, I can want the best for my clients. I can want to do everything that I can do, but there's only so much that I can do if not only are the laws written against me and everything is against me, but the public's like social consciousness is also against me. So there isn't going to be a way to really change that. And something, I think an example of that is I had a case, a police brutality case in New York that like shortly after the George Floyd protests, where my client, like the police had been kneeling on his neck on a video, and my client had been charged with like riding his ATV illegally, right? Which is something the police pick and choose when they feel like enforcing or caring about or criminalizing, right? And so, but technically speaking, you know what I mean? Right. If they want to say my client that he rode this ATV and he's not supposed to, they have him on that, right? Like within the court. If I'm just left, if my only tools to fight this are just in the court, there's nothing I can do. But what I did was take that case to the court of public opinion. Like, hey, look at this video. Look at what's happening. And eventually they had to dismiss those charges against my client. So I think what being a lawyer and fighting from the inside taught me was that advocacy has to extend beyond the courtroom. Like, we'll only ever be between a rock and a hard place if we're not able to appeal to the public and get the public to, like, one, be aware of how it works in application and what's wrong with these things, and so that they support us. Because the public we would have a lot more support. I think a lot more support for our, progressive initiatives and the things that we want to do if the public was aware of it, and you had more people who were in the system who know exactly what's wrong there and willing to translate that message to the masses. So I don't reckon with it. I just know it. I just, like, one hat allows me to do one thing and the other hat allows me to do the other thing, and I try to make them complement each other.
So that's important because, one of the ways that we've been taught to think about policing and prisons are mechanisms of accountability, mechanisms of supporting community, mechanisms of enabling safer spaces for us as a community. And one of the things I learned from CJ's book, and specifically from the conversation with you, Zellie, is that I need to think about community a little bit differently. You kind of challenge us to reimagine the possibilities of community and the limits of the current carceral project for allowing healthy community. So I guess the place I would want to start with you is helping us first, just tell us, like, how did you enter into this world? How do you become activist? How do you become organizer? How do you become someone who isn't just in the community doing work, which can always be reformist? It doesn't even have to be healthy, right? I mean, people be in community doing all kinds of dangerous work for us, right? But that you're in our community doing healing work, but also doing radical work. You're trying to uproot the current systems and help us reimagine new abolitionist possibilities. How do you get there? How do you become that person?
Yeah, I think it comes through a lot of studying and a lot of self-education. And I don't think that we can create the world that we want to create without that political education, that we as a people cannot be afraid of being politically educated. And I was one that was not afraid to go out of that little box that we put ourselves in the Black community, that we have to be a Democrat. It's like, no, you don't have to be a Democrat just because I'm Black, or I don't have to have this particular politics because I'm Black. I'm going to research about socialism. I'm going to research about communism. I'm going to research about anarchism. And through that research, I was able to learn not only about these structures and policies that are in place that are harmful to us, that are oppressing us, but also empowered me to imagine a world where a system like that didn't exist. And that to me was the beauty of anarchism, the beauty of revolution, not simply the dismantling of these oppressive structures, but the ability to create structures that will empower us and bring us the healing that we deserve.
How hard was it for you to get to that space? Because the evidence is always against us, right? The evidence is always against radical change. The evidence is always against dismantling the power structure. I mean, that's the genius of power, is that they have us believe not just that they're hard to defeat, but they create a world where we don't even question their power, right? It's not an orthodoxy, it's a doxa, right? As Bourdieu would say, like there's a way that it just is. We can't think outside of it.
Yeah, I think that's one of the toughest things that we had to experience, throughout this movement. As CJ and you all mentioned before, is that the abolitionist movement did not start in 2016 or 2020. It always existed, right? And these pockets of people continue to spread the word, spread the message, and educate people throughout the year. So even when there was a 2014 and Mike Brown, when it's a big explosion that occurred, and then momentum died down, the education didn't stop, right? The political education, the community organizing did not stop. Even the protests were not the same. It doesn't mean that the organizing stopped. And The organizing continued to build and build and build, so that when 2020 happened, it was a larger explosion, right? So you see now, like, maybe people aren't talking about defund right now, but we see it happening right now with the Liberation for Palestine movement, all right? We see it now. Like, I see tactics and strategies that we were using in 2020 being replicated now in the in the Palestinian liberation movement. So I'm always in a sense that I understand that political education is always happening, and that we are leaving behind other pieces for other people to pick up.
What's mutual aid?
Yeah, mutual aid is a philosophy, and it's also a practice. It's the idea that we as human beings, we all have something that we need, and we always have something to give as well. And that capitalism teaches us that we get further ahead through competition, that we get further ahead through hoarding our resources. And mutual aid is this idea that no, we don't get further ahead by hoarding resources or being in competition with one another, but we actually get further ahead by being in solidarity with one another and by being in collaboration with one another and actually sharing our resources. And that mutual aid concept really for me took a heed in the 2020 pandemic when the government shut down and businesses shut down, and all around the country they was telling you the safest thing to do is to stay indoors. But the safest thing for people who had resources was to stay indoors. But the people without resources, that was not the safest thing for them. The people who were elderly, the people who had disabilities, who was going to help them because they wasn't able to go outside, to go to the grocery store to get the resources. They wasn't able to go to, the medical store to get their medicine. So who was going to support them in those times of need? And it was community that was going to support them, right? Community is a verb. It's just not about being in proximity to one another. It's about how you are able to support your neighbor in those times of need. And we've seen that happen through the COVID-19 pandemic and even after the pandemic, because we continue to do mutual aid even after the numbers started to dwindle down. And people used to ask us all the time, like, hey, why are you still delivering food to the elderly? Why are you still delivering food to those that's disabled? And we always had to tell them that it shouldn't take a global pandemic for us to care for one another.
That's exactly right. I was thinking about, CJ, maybe I'm old now, so I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, maybe a little more than 10 years, maybe 15 years, 10 or 15 years ago, I was at Gustavus Davis College in Minnesota. And I was speaking with Angela Davis, and I were doing a conversation about mass incarceration and abolition. And
Nice
before
fact.
it's like yeah. Yeah, me and Angela, we were just chilling,
Chilling, right?
But I remember before we did it, and it was maybe the first or second event I'd done with Angela, but it was the first time we got a chance to really talk. And she said to me, 20 years ago she said in the 70s and 80s, we could not have even had this conversation at a university campus. She said there was so much shame. There was so much, there was just such a commitment, not just to, this was a topic we couldn't even talk about. It wasn't even about the ideological differences. It was like, this is not something you talk about in polite company. This ain't something you talk about in middle class company. This ain't something you talk about in academic spaces. And I think about that moment to the reform conversations in the 80s and 90s. I remember when we started, even when we were talking abolition at that event at Gustavus Davis in Minnesota, people were still like, abolition, that shit sounds crazy. And now you on Twitter and everybody's hashtag abolition. Even people that don't know what it is, they still hashtagging abolition, right? It felt like such a lightning speed sort of shift from it being, it was like slow. Now we're here. A lot of social movements have like that. They seem like nothing's happening until everything happens. How do you all make sense of how rich and mainstreamed the conversation is? Even if the politicians are saying no, just like they were saying no to legalizing weed, just like they were saying no to marriage equality, it was at least a conversation suddenly. How did this suddenly become a conversation that you ain't got to sneak and have in lefty basements and, you know what I mean, and these workers collectives, or, you know what I mean, behind, deeply closed doors? You can have it in the public sphere. People are debating on presidential stages,
Yeah.
or on the Breakfast Club, you know what I'm saying, like wherever, you know what I'm saying. Shout out to Ole. Like, how does this happen so fast? CJ, why don't you, since you framed the book, but I want to hear from everybody on this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, obviously social media plays a huge part because it can connect us and and bring us together and have kind of conversation that really becomes instantaneously and global, right? So it doesn't just have to be, you know, the basement or in that kind of whisper, so we can kind of put our thoughts out there. But, you know, in that kind of rush of, you know, how defund in this moment became such a big deal was we saw, you know, Joe Biden speaking at the pulpit at the State of the Union, right, claiming that defund wasn't a thing and that we need to fund the police. And for me, I saw that as, well, he's scared to death that this thing is taking like full formation, because presidents don't talk about things that don't matter, right? And this mattered. And then we also saw the Republicans co-opt it, right? Just like how they've tried to co-opt things like, instead of saying Black Lives Matter, all lives matter, we've seen Republicans say, you know, Marjorie Taylor Greene, defund the FBI, or Trump himself saying defund the DOJ. And so, you know, something has legs when the people who put raisins in the potato salad try to co-opt it. And so that became a real point for me that was why this is needed, and that, you know, we're in it for the long haul. And, you know, the thing I'll say before we pass the mic is that, you know, I'm in abolition for the long haul, and I fully expect that by the time I'm old and an elder, I'm learning from younger folks that say, you know what, abolition is the conservative thing now. We're on to something even more radical, and because I think that's the beauty about what abolition allows us to do. It allows us to reimagine and imagine things in a whole different lens that, you know, again, I'm hoping in 15, 20 years from now, Mark, that I'm sitting with some folks who just said, yeah, abolition was the starting point. We're now on to whatever that next iteration is.
I mean, that's how I felt in the 90s when we were, you know, I was part of, you know, organizations in the community in the mid 90s as a first grader. You know, we were talking about, you know, firing the white cops, you know, hiring some black cops. We just wanted to get beat by black cops. You know what I mean? Like our ambition wasn't nearly as bold as what these kids are talking about. Abolition wasn't even in our realm of thought. We were making radical decisions by saying Rodney King just got beat. Yo, this is why we need black cops in the community. This is why they got to live in our community. That's why we need a black, you know, police chief. We were fighting for those kinds of reforms. I mean, obviously, critical resistance was, you know, was emerging, and there were radical movements in the grassroots that were coming up. But I'm saying in the mainstream activist circles, that wasn't even on our minds. To your point, so I'm like, damn, what's next? Like what's going to be so dope and radical that we can't even imagine it yet? But Zellie, jump on in. I'm sorry. Yep.
Yeah. Like, you're killing it right now. Like, I completely agree. It's like, I can't even begin to imagine like what is going to be coming up next. So what was happening, especially in 2020, was a beautiful thing. And I think a large part of it had to do, again, with social media. For a long time, we got all of our news from the mainstream media, and they was dictating to us what to believe and what the limits of the possibilities for our future was. And then social media allowed us to be our own curators and our own reporters, and to be able to talk to one another without having to wonder what you know, a Dom Lemon was saying or whoever was saying on CNN or whatever the case may be. And so we was able to have these conversations with ourselves, and people was being introduced to these new terms like, what are those young people talking about, this defund thing? And I remember in Patterson specifically, with Black Lives Matter Patterson, we was knocking on doors. We had a whole large canvassing campaign, knocking on people's doors in the hood, having one-to-one conversations with people about defunding the police and what that actually meant. But we didn't use the word defund. We was asking them like, hey, like, what do you think is wrong right now with our communities? And they would say, you know, there's not a lot of recreation for our kids. The garbage isn't being picked up. And it's like, all right, did you know that the police budget is $30 million and recreation is only like $1.5 million? Right. And they're like, what? And it's like, you think maybe we could take like maybe just $2 million from the police budget just to fund for more recreation, since you're thinking that, you know, we need more recreation, or $1 million or $2 million from police budget to put it for DPW so that we can get our trash picked up. And then was like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And then you had these little old ladies calling into city council meetings saying defund the police, right? So it wasn't just like Zellie from Black Lives Matter, this radical saying it. You had people from all walks of life calling in the city council meetings talking about we need to defund the police.
I mean, go ahead, Ola. That's a powerful point, even in terms of the languaging of it.
Did you want me to answer the same thing, or were you going to move on?
Yeah.
The way I look at it, the reason why you see, I feel like you see this now in this rise of us even be able to talk about these things is because of how bad things are, right? Like, to me, the more progressive you hear the thought or how radical you think the thought is a reflection of how bad the times are, right? Because if you even look at, like I said, the culmination of these efforts, right? Like in 2020, right? When people started paying attention, the reason why people were paying attention or you saw such a swell of support is because you had a global pandemic, and all the effects of that, right, on people, right? The capitalist, not people focused system that we have is why so many people were down and out during the pandemic. So many people still haven't recovered, and that's why they were able to see the brutality that Black people and marginalized people in this country were facing at the hands of the police. That's why they were able to see how ineffective the police have been, and that level of like attention and that level of radicalization has carried through, right? And I think. And it's consistent. It hasn't fallen off the way the media would have you believe. What actually has increased and what has been amplified are efforts to suppress people getting access to information. You see the book banning. You see the attacks on affirmative action. You see the attacks on DEI. You see all these attacks on curriculum. You see them trying to ban TikTok. There are so many overt ways that you can see the government clamoring to halt, to thwart social justice movements, because what they realize is the more people know, the more radicalized they become, the more that they oppose these systems. So yeah, and listen, I'm excited. I already think I see the generation of people more radical than me. I see them every day. Every day they tell me I'm a shit blue lib. You know what I mean? So I think we already see them, and I think it's amazing because, like, I don't see myself. I might be a radical at best, but I don't see any but like myself as the revolutionary who's going to do it, right? But I think what's beautiful is if you can even attempt to be a part of inspiring those people, right? Like I always feel like Angela Davis don't know me, unlike Marc, but she sure did educate me. You know what I mean? Without an Angela Davis, without my thesis, my college thesis advisor giving me "Are prisons obsolete?" Who knows to say? Like, who's to say would I ever been an abolitionist, right? And even though I might not be a revolutionary, I might not be the person that I think is, burning it all down or doing all the change. What efforts I have made and my little bit of individual contributions that I've tried to make to this movement or tried to make to people is brought about by people like Angela Davis and the people that are doing that work. So I hope if I could even just be the inspiration for any of this generation.
Let me tell you something. The moment you dress down Eric Adams on the Breakfast Club in front of millions, your jersey went in the rafters. You ain't got to do nothing else, man. You already earned your spot. Let me ask you a real nuts and bolts question, and I always struggle with this for lots of reasons, right? But there's always the what does this look like question. You can't talk defunding and abolition without being confronted with a very pragmatic question, which sometimes is well intended and sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's cynical. Sometimes it's hopeful. Sometimes it's fearful. Sometimes it's confrontational. Some people are asking that question because they think you ain't got no answer. Some people are saying it because they want you to give them permission to believe that this is possible. How do you all deal with the question of what does our world look like when the PIC, the prison industrial complex, is defunded, when police in particular is defunded? What does that world look like?
Can I say this? I feel like whenever people are talking about abolition or anything that's progressive or anything designed to protect marginalized people, everybody talks to us as though like we are asking to come up with a mythical universe for wizarding people. You know what I mean? I'm like, right. I would like you to do what you do for everybody that's not us. Yeah, we live, right? They think about it. They talk about it. We live in two different Americas, right? They say we live in two different Americas because there's a way that we are treated and responded to, which is not the experience of other people. I want the same way, like a Joe Biden would never think that Hunter Biden should be met with the criminal law for his issues or struggles with drugs. I want the same treatment. I want the same treatment I want the Black communities I live in. I want for the Black people, poor Black people, poor brown people. I want the people that live in Flatbush with me to get the same treatment that all the people that went to boarding school with me got, that all the people I went to law school with got. You know what I mean? All these people that I went to boarding school with in West Virginia, and all these people, all these white people that get this treatment, I want them to get that. So it's like, I don't think we need to reinvent a new world. We want you to let us live in the same just world, the same world that treats you with compassion, with grace, that says your communities don't need to be littered with police, that says, oh, you shouldn't be criminalized, that says you get to have useful mistakes, that you get to be a teen, that you get to do all these different things. I want the same grace that they already give in this world right here. I want that given to us. So that's
a great question. Now, Zellie, I'm gonna push you even further, because I know a lot of your work, particularly in Patterson, is about like on the ground, just like everybody else here, but you're on the ground talking to people. The people who need the police the most in our collective understanding of what need means, I'm using need in quotes, but the people put it like this. I live in the hood. I'm going to hear a gunshot in the next 48 hours. Someone is going to get shot. Someone needs help, right? It's hard for me to tell that person to imagine a world without policing and prisons if I don't have an answer to what's going to happen when that person gets shot. It's hard for me to tell women who are the most vulnerable for sexual assault and sexual violence on the street that we should that who are you going to call when you are faced with threats or actual violence. Now, so we have to have answers. I think there are answers. Obviously, I'm an abolitionist.
I'm gonna let Zellie talk. I'm gonna let Zellie talk, but I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that in this current world where we have all the police, in fact, like let's say we take a New York City where you will hear all these different things. The fact alone that in the hypothetical, it's when you hear when you do hear a gunshot, when someone gets shot, when you experience sexual violence, when you experience crime, when it's a definite in this current world with all the police, right? So it's like when we talk about the police, we're only talking about how they respond to the circumstances that are already there and that they're not doing anything to change, right? So it's like, yes, no one is disputing that crime is terrible, that you are going to experience crime and that you want something to be done about it. But currently, you have all those police, you have all the police, you have all the system, and none of those things are stopping. So I'm
right. But if you said that to my auntie, I agree with you. But if you said that to my auntie, you know what she would say? She would say, well, then how is getting rid of the police going to stop those numbers from going up and getting worse? And I'm just saying we have to have something. If we want people to buy into our freedom dream, and again, I think abolition is the answer.
Yeah.
I'm just curious to know sort of how we convince people to invest in this dream when the here and now is so dangerous and people feel so vulnerable, and they've been taught to believe that the only thing stopping them from being completely vulnerable is that dude with the badge that's locking up their kids, or that court that's over criminalizing us. I mean, I'm not defending these systems. I'm just saying these are the questions that people ask me every day when I talk abolition, and I struggle sometimes. I'll be honest with you. Sometimes I struggle for the reason that you just described, Ole. I'm like, this shit ain't working. Why are we so committed to a system that doesn't work?
Well, I would just say real quick, it's the only system that we know, right? We don't have an alternative, right? Everyone would only drink Coca-Cola if that's the only soda you had, right? But when you have options, you can deviate from that. We don't have that, or at least we don't have that on the scale and magnitude that we need it, because we also know, and to bring up to your point around women's sexual violence, assault, we know that cops are one of the most, purveyors of that type of violence.
Oh my God, yes.
There's a great book by Leah Goodmark called Imperfect Victims, and about how, calling the cops for those types of crimes doesn't necessarily help the victims in any kind of way. So I think that's part of the charge of defund is to create systems that give us other options, give us other outlets, and have other folks who can see a moment in I lost my train of thought, but go ahead, Zellie, I'm sorry.
Sorry, y'all. I apologize for the magic of TV here. That's not so magical. I have to switch to my cell phone to get into the car because I got a child care emergency, but we're going to finish this conversation. So what I'm going to do, who was about to answer that question?
I just jumped in, but I know you had Zellie on deck,
Oh yeah,
so I want to let him
I
go.
it was because Zellie, we're talking to people, and I think what I found persuasive, what I always found persuasive, is when you and Ole talk about sort of we're taking this from here and investing it in us.
Yeah.
You know, I find that to be helpful language. What are some other ways that you engage people and compel them to believe in this really ambitious and beautiful dream of abolition?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely hear, some of those same pushbacks that, all of us are hearing, that fear that so many people have when it comes to this idea of a world without no police, right? That when people think of a world without police, they think that it is not, it's going to be a world without safety, that it's going to be a world of violence. But we already have violence to your point. So in order to create this world that has safety, we have to create things, systems, and institutions that will bring us real safety, because police cannot be an institution that brings us safety if they're also the institution that oppresses us and brings us harm and brings us trauma. We need a institution that actually bring us the safety that we all deserve and that we all need. And there's so many different examples that exist throughout the country. And I think for, Patterson in itself, last year we experienced a traumatic event where a young brother named Najee Seabrooks, who was a hospital violence worker, who called himself for emergency 911 because he was going through a mental health crisis. And he also called his employers at the Patterson Healing Collective, who was a hospital-based violence interruption group, to come in and support him. The police arrived first and did not let the crisis intervention team of the Patterson Healing Collective come and handle that crisis. Instead, they went inside the building armed with that SWAT gear, the shields, the batons, and the helmets, and shot him with different beanbags and stun guns, and ultimately shot him with live rounds. So when he called 911 for help, instead of getting that help that actually did exist, he was met with police officers who ultimately killed him. And that also happened in a nearby town of Jersey City a couple months later. It was so familiar that when I was reading the article, I stopped reading the article because I thought it was another article about Najee. I didn't even realize it was another article about a different man in a different nearby city. So when you talk to people, they automatically will tell you now that, yeah, police shouldn't be the people who are responding to a mental health crisis. Police should not be the people who may be responding to a substance use crisis as well, because they're not going to arrive with that support, that passion, and that care. They're going to come with that aggression. They're going to come with that superiority complex, and they're going to come with that violence mentality that's going to ultimately harm the individual and lead to that individual's potential death. So instead, what we need is what's happening in other countries, where there is a community crisis intervention team, a team that is made up of EMT, a mental health professional, and a community caseworker who are trained in de-escalation tactics, who are unarmed, right? And what we see in Eugene, Oregon, and other places in Oakland where these institutions do exist, obviously, when those crisis intervention teams arrive at a crisis, they don't kill the individual, right? Because they're unarmed, right? And most of the times, they don't even have to call for a police backup. So we not only see individuals coming through that crisis unharmed, they're also not leaving it arrested as well. And that's a win-win for our community. And like you mentioned, what we need to be able to do is present these different alternatives to the community, right? Because for so long, we've been taught that the police are our only option, when that's not the case. And in order to have these institutions and sustain them, we need to be able to sustain them from that police budget that you continuously put money into. So we can't say that we do not have money for, the community crisis team when we continue to pump money into police officers' budgets.
And I think we just need to remember that, like I said, I echo everything that Zellie said, and I think we need to be careful not to dehumanize ourselves just because the oppressors dehumanize us, right? Like there's this, they want you to believe in the way that they talk about and think about Black people is like we are some wild, uncontrollable animals, that there's nothing that can be done for us but to control us. We need to constantly be under subjugation and be controlled and policed in that way. And in so many ways, we have unwittingly internalized that same thought process about ourselves because we do this thing that's like, yes, when crime is happening in our communities, or if people are being shot, or if there's violence, but we can ask ourselves, it is okay to ask why. We're not just wild animals, and these things are not just happening because we are these like uncontrollable beasts who can't be helped or just come onto the earth as bad people, right? There is a why. People are growing up in communities where they are forced to contend with violence. Violence is there. They're born to messed up circumstances. They are born to lack of resources. They are born to having to navigate families, neighbors, and people who are struggling with mental health issues. They are born to these circumstances, right? So how is this happening? How is violence coming about, and all these different things? So instead of, I think something to always remember is like there are people in the communities themselves saying exactly what they need, right? These, like the people who don't want to give us money, who don't want to give our communities money, who don't want to resource our communities, act as though they have nothing. They don't know what to do, or no one's telling them what to do, or we're not giving them solutions or suggestions, but they are. And I think about the many, many different people that I've represented in the criminal system, and talking to, like, especially ones who struggled with mental health, and you talk to their families and they're telling you how they have been struggling with the same thing their entire lives. They've been trying to get the resources, but they never had it, and how many different red tape there is for the system. And what happens is problems exacerbate, right? Like by the time somebody has a much smaller problem, it's like, you know, when you have a cavity, you have a tiny cavity, and the dentist tells you that you need to get that soon because eventually it'll be a huge cavity, and the kind of procedure that it will need will be something that's much more expensive, much more difficult, much more invasive. It's the same thing with us, right? If we refuse to give ourselves, or they refuse to give our communities what we need in the beginning, when it's a small problem or a small issue, it gets worse, and by the time they even are willing to like acknowledge that there's a problem, they're only looking at it, and they will only look at it when it seems insurmountable, when it seems too big, or they don't know where it happened, rather than the totality of the circumstance. So I think what I want to encourage us to do is to ask why. Like when these things happen that we're so scared of, or these scenarios that we don't want to see in our community, ask ourselves why that happened. And I think in the process that it takes you to ask why this is happening, you'll also be able to answer why getting more police and putting more money into the policing will not do anything to address that problem. That's what.
And if I could just,
I think that. Oh yeah, please jump on in.
I was just going to say too, just to kind of round out your question, Mark. You know, I think it also has, you know, when folks ask us these questions, which, you know, certainly we want to give the most fleshed out answer to, is how we also respond. And I think, you know, someone who, I started out doing anti-death penalty abolitionist work, and you know, it was in Pennsylvania, and if you ask Pennsylvania residents, you know, do you believe in the death penalty as a yes and no binary? A lot of them just kind of knee-jerk yes, because it was on the books and it's what it was. But when we talk to folks like, well, what do you look at as public safety? Death penalty never came up, right? It was all things like recreation, better schools, you know, crossing guards. Like it was things like that. And we said, oh, you know, so not the death penalty. And then it kind of takes them a second to be like, oh yeah, I guess we don't really need the death penalty. And then you hit them with the stats of like Pennsylvania doesn't use it, or whatever the case. So I think that, and then the last thing I'll say is, you know, I do a lot of work with youth who are incarcerated in New York City, and so, you know, I'm constantly infusing abolition into the conversations, into the restorative justice work that we do. And, you know, I asked them point blank, like, if you could replace this prison, this jail that you were locked up in with something else, what would it be? And they answer honestly, you know, they want a mall, they want a hospital, they want, you know, an apartment building. And then I remember one young man said he wanted a luxury hotel. And when I asked him, I said, well, why a luxury hotel? He said, why do all the rich people just get to have that downtown? And so what folks were asking for were things that were just absent in the community: a mall to hang out with, a hospital that, you know, focused on gunshot victims, because these were the things that they were experiencing, and that's what they wanted. So again, I always want to bring abolition out of the sky a bit, that it's not some crazy, lofty unicorn, that we can really have it, right? Like, as I think Olay and Zellie said, right? Like, folks want a place to have community, to go, right, where they can feel safe, where they can just chill without having over police presence, being harassed while you're out here. Because all the kids tell me their first contact with law enforcement is usually over some bullshit, and usually with something with cameras, right? So if you're living in a community where there's over police presence, particularly with, cop cams, I'm sure them kids ain't doing anything different than kids in the suburbs are doing. The difference is the kids in the suburbs, at least in the beginning, are not being on camera in the same way. So we have to really think about, taking the youth and what they're saying and really put it into implementation.
One of the things that I find helpful for helping us think about ending the carceral state is helping people understand that the carceral state hasn't always existed, right? That it can be dated and structured and historicized. There's a beginning and there will be an end. One of the things the book does so wonderfully in one of the chapters is really help us think about this as the prison as an artifact of colonialism, as an extension of a broader kind of project of maybe even racial capitalism. How important is it for us to understand the prison as a colonial project?
I'll take that first, and absolutely, and I think it's tethered both to the past, the present, and if we don't do anything about it, the future. And I think we see that right now in what's happening to Palestine, right? We cannot divorce the interconnectedness of how NYPD, which was kettling us up at City College, learned some of those same tactics from IDF and Israeli police, and how we send U.S. police forces over there. We send U.S. corrections officers, right? I mean, I don't know how many people know this, but if we remember back to the Iraq War in Abu Ghraib, right, the torture camp in Abu Ghraib, the lead soldier on that, his civilian job was a corrections officer at SCI Green in Pennsylvania, right? And it came out that there were a number of folks who were locked up who made complaints about the torture, the assaults that he did. So it's all interconnected. And so if we don't change course, we're going to continue to replicate these forms of punishment, torture, and incarceration. And again, consistently, we see it with racial capital, that it is consistently low income, folks of color, trans folks, people who are at the margins that these things happen to. I mean, it's not to deviate from what we're talking about, but it shouldn't be lost on us that the serial killers that get away with it the most are the ones who target folks of color, particularly trans folks, particularly poor folks, particularly sex workers, because they know they can get away with it for a longer period of time because cops don't care about those people. Society doesn't care about that people. Try to be a serial killer that goes and kills rich white women, you will be caught in the first day. And so
Day one.
Day one. Day one. So I think that's really important for us to think through.
I'm glad you asked that. Actually, you took an interesting sort of point up that came up in one of the audience questions, which was it's hard to think about much of anything these days without immediately jumping to the genocide in Gaza. This is from an audience member. They said, I'm curious what connections the speakers see between defund and divest.
Want me to go again? Y'all want to? All right, I'll go again. So I would say that if we look at kind of the genesis, the genesis and then the kind of scale, that defund comes out of the divestment movement, right? If we think about South African apartheid or decarcerate, I think that they all build upon each other. Defund, at least for me, and the reason why I felt like I wanted to write this was that it captured an audience, particularly a new audience, in a way that, folks who either were too young or just weren't alive, during other divestment movements saw. So I think that, as I pointed out, right, we're seeing those interconnections between how law enforcement around the globe. I mean, it's kind of crazy to see German police beating the hell out of people saying stop genocide. You know what I mean? Like, to me, the optics of that is just wild, right? Because they feel this kind of indebtedness to the state of Israel, or we see it happening across the United States on college campuses. And I was at City College, part of being a professor at CUNY, and I was there every day. And you know what it was? Some days it felt more like a picnic, right? There was no violence or people talking violence. People was making, egg and cheese sandwiches, talking about social justice classes, different speakers, and to see the NYPD come into that space in such a violent way, and even CUNY security, right, have these kind of goon squads, pepper spraying students, calling students all types of curse words, swinging on students, was wild, right? But again, whenever we push back against, whatever the status quo is, it's going to be met with violence. I saw, it was a meme today from Fidel Castro that, the revolutionaries don't want violence. It's the system that pushes us to take on more radical approaches.
That's a powerful point. Let me jump to another question from the audience. One of them is, would banning raisins in potato salad be a reformist reform or a non-reformist reform? I'll let y'all ponder that for a future time. But another question came up, which was, how should we be responding to the massive pushback against the demands of defund and abolition that ramped up after the uprisings? And they're saying both practically and rhetorically, how do we push back against the pushback?
Yeah, I think that we have to continue to organize, right? And that one of the things that we consistently do as of a people, as people who are passionate, people who care about other people, we are really great at mobilizing. We mobilize great over injustice. We mobilize great over viral videos and viral imagery. But it shouldn't take a viral moment for us to be outraged, and it shouldn't take a viral moment for us to be inspired to be put into action. Just by living in these oppressive conditions, we should be inspired to continuously move. And the only way we can do that is by continuing to organize with one another. And that organizing has to consist of political education. So we have to, in these moments, not be overtly concerned with the pushback, because the pushback is going to be happening. Because if we focus too much on the pushback, we are going to be finding ourselves responding to every single thing that our oppressor does, and we never have the time or energy to actually create the world that we say that we deserve. So we also, at the same time as being able to fight, be able to create that space for us to say, okay, we can't fight every single time that they are pushing back to us. We can't fight every single thing that they say. We also have to be able to create the alternatives, right? So it's better for us to actually show and prove, a model, versus for us to say, hey, we have an idea of what could possibly work. Let's put our energy and our resources into creating the things that we say are going to save us. And that's one of the things that we are trying to do so much in Black Lives Matter Patterson, and I know so many other organizations across the country, where we are focusing on creating these mutual aid networks. We're creating these opioid response teams to respond to opioid crisis or opioid overdoses, so that cops don't have to respond to those situations. We are creating the things that we are saying that we do not need cops to respond, so that we can show the people, like, hey, if we invest in these systems, right, we don't need the police, because you can hire a police officer and put a police officer on every corner of our cities that will not stop sexual violence from happening inside the homes. That's not going to stop child abuse from happening inside the homes, right? In order for us to help our survivors, is not by hiring more police officers, but actually investing into the resources that will actually help our survivors.
And if I could just piggyback off of Zellie, and I think it was something that Zellie said beautifully in the book, is that march is only a fractional part of what social movements do. And if you go to a march, you walk from this block to that block and that block, and you chant the phrases, but you don't turn to the person next to you and get to know them, ask their name, get their contact information, right? Then, you're not really in it, right? Like, so part of it is that, yes, people come together over these moments of terribleness, but it's that building out part that, okay, now we have contact. All right, we have this meeting next week. You think you can come and bring a friend, and then you can have those kind of political education classes. I think that's what's so beautiful. And then, from that, one thing that Mike and Debbie Davis talked about in their chapter was like, you can't always have everybody on the front lines, right? Like you have to have folks who are going to be on the front lines, right? So in those types of strategies need to be discussed from the jump, like who's able to be arrested, who's willing to be arrested, but who's also willing to stay behind and make sure that the babies are okay, or that folks, when they get out of lockup, are going to have a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, so they have something to eat, because we can't assume that they got fed while they was locked up for the last 8 hours waiting for the desk appearance ticket or whatever citation or charges they're going to be with. So I think it's about all of that, building that sustainability, that we're constantly doing something, and not just waiting for the next big hashtag and hoping. I mean, because that to me is always weird too, right? Like people waiting for the next hashtag. Like we all kind of understand that might happen, or that might whatever, that someone's going to get killed, that it's going to go viral, but like I don't know. I find it weird when people are like, I'm kind of waiting for that so I can get back in the streets, because I'm like, so you kind of waiting for Black Death to happen? Are you waiting for someone to be brutalized? Like, I'm not waiting for that. I'm trying to be proactive in that. I'm trying to do things to make sure that the young guys who I work with aren't ending up back in the system, and that they're not going home and being shot at, and that they have new visions for their outlook, right? And it's just all the little places that we can be. Yeah, I don't know. I'm just excited about the work that we can all do in our own spheres and our own networks, right? Have a conversation, go to a meeting, donate to causes, right? I mean, I proudly donate to Zellie's cause when I can. I know he does beautiful work, summer education programs, the stop the gunshot violence stuff, the community refrigerator. I mean, these are beautiful things, right? If you have $1 or $2, donate it. Yeah.
I think that's so important to do, and I think we romanticize the person who gets arrested. That's the sexy story, right? Yeah, I got locked up, I spent the night, I carried out the handcuffs. It's the next day that's hard work. Jesse Jackson used to talk about that. Getting locked up, he said, as bad as it was, you could get people to get up and get locked up, but it was the organizing, it was the photocopying, it was the political education, it was the day-to-day grind of organizing toward the future we wanted. That was a challenge to get people to buy into and to engage. And so we absolutely have to do that. Before we go, I wanted to ask a question that someone in the audience also had on their mind, and that is, what are your recommendations for additional readings for people who are new to this? A lot of times we've read all this stuff, and we mention the stuff kind of in passing, all the heavy stuff. Where do people start? And let me say this: start with Defund. Start with this book. Go grab this one. Grab 2 of them. Give one to your cousin. Give one to your comrades. But in addition to this fine book, what else should people be reading and thinking about?
Well, I'll start real quick. The thing that I love to do when I read is, and I always tell my students this, is, and I guess I'm a little old too, Mark, because when I started reading, I used to sit there with a thesaurus and a dictionary next to me, but I guess now I could just use my phone. But, when I read things, I go to those appendix. I go to those footnotes. I go to those endnotes. I see who they're citing, and, I make sure I add that book to the list. But I think in terms of, for me at least, some foundational texts that helped me really come to where I am now, obviously Angela Davis's Are Prisons Obsolete? Angela Davis's Abolition, Democracy, Marc Lamont Hill's Classroom and the Cell, Mumia Abu-Jamal, Live on Death Row. My absolute most favorite book on this planet is Mumia Abu-Jamal's Death Blossoms. I think that's so beautifully written. And how he even talks about like how we should be thinking through violence and how do we combat violence. Assata Shakur's autobiography, because you read that and you're like, this is not a Hollywood movie. This is a person's actual life who was locked up in a men's facility, who was sexually assaulted in prison, who's on the run because this country wants to kill her. I think all those books are great in terms of some, for me at least, some foundational texts. And then I'll just give one plug. I also wrote a book last year called Purgatory Citizenship, Reentry, Race, and Abolition. And so one thing that I'm also thinking through too is how do we think about reentry as abolition, right? Or how do we abolish reentry and not need that system as well? So I'll stop there and pass the mic.
Yeah, I'll jump in real quick. Just similarly like to you, that's what I did in college all the time. It was just like when I was reading, say for example, like book, right? I'm reading his autobiography and everything that he mentioned that he was reading. I'm like, all right, let me grab that too from the library. I want to know everything that everyone else was reading to try to get on the same page as them. So for me, one of the things I always recommend is reading autobiographies, reading memoirs of our great heroes from the Black radical tradition. And one of the books that I definitely recommend is called We Will Return in the Whirlwind. It's an amazing book. It really details, from SNCC, all the Black labor organizing that occurred in the 60s and the 70s in Detroit, the Black Power movement of RAM, the Black Panther parties, their emergence. So you get all these nitty gritty details because again, when you think about, the Black Panther Party, you just think about the brothers in the black leather jackets and the guns, and you don't think about the organizing and what it actually took. Because as us, as folks who are like millennials or Gen Zers or whatever the case may be, you know about these things. You may know about, the Black Panthers feeding people and you want to do it, but you're like, I don't know how they did it though, right? Or you knew about the Montgomery bus boycott, but you know exactly how it happened. Like we always be told, like it happened, it was a boycott, Martin Luther King did a speech, civil rights was won. It's like, what actually was the organizing that happened that I can actually take and learn from and replicate now? And those are the stories that we need to learn, because if we're not being taught through it orally through our elders, we have to get it through books.
Word. Ole, where would you advise people to look as they're new to this abolition game and they want sources?
Well, I have a list of book recommendations on my website, olayemiolurin.com, but I would say, hold on, let me move the mic here while I look at my bookcase. I would say Are Prisons Obsolete by Angela Davis, To Die for the People by Huey Newton. Hold on. We Will Not Cancel Us by Adrienne Marie Brown. Victoria Law, Prisons Make Us Safer. Honestly, I think there's a lot like books that you wouldn't even think of that like as directly abolition, but I think are really necessary to kind of like zooming out and understanding why things like that are necessary. So I would say Patriarchy Blues by Frederick Joseph, End of Policing by Alex Vital. I have let me tell you, I think Ferguson, Freedom is a Constant Struggle by Angela Davis. Blood in My Eye by George Jackson.
I just thought Miriam Kaba's We Do This Till We Free Us is a good one.
Yeah, definitely anything about her.
Absolutely.
That's my first one. Okay, so I have a lot. That's what I will go with for now, but I have a million. Sorry, y'all.
No, a million is good. I mean, it's a good place to start because again, people don't know where to start, and sometimes the abolition conversation can seem theoretical, it can seem abstract, it can seem very classed.
I think the first place to start is Are Prisons Obsolete for everybody. To me, I think that's the entryway drug. Like it really, there's something very like, so it's direct and it's concise. Like my boyfriend was radicalized, child. He calls that his book. He makes sure like, where did you put my book on the bookcase? Okay, yeah. I think that's the entryway for everybody.
And I think where to start. I think that connects to like one of the other questions earlier, because maybe in the 90s we would think about the solution to the police brutality that we were experiencing. It was, we need to hire more Black officers, or the officers need to live in our areas. And what abolition is doing, or the defund movement, I don't want to separate it from this anti-capitalist, movement as well, right? Because they're all connected. That we cannot have a world without prisons or a world without police if we have a world of capitalism as well. So we cannot leave
That's right.
out that idea that we are just not fighting for a world without police or prisons. We're fighting for a world where all human beings are actually free. And that means the end of capitalism as well, and the end to imperialism. So that is why the divest movement and defund movement, and why you see such a strong bond between the movement for Black lives and the movement for Palestine, because we understand that it's just not about a Black police officer. It's about systems that are oppressing us physically, monetarily, and laborly, all the ways.
And I
No,
would just, I would just say real quick, I know we're running short on time, is also, look for abolition outside of just, books, right? Look at it in like how it shows up in art, look at it how it shows up in music. And maybe not, again, as Ole and Zellie were saying, it doesn't have to be a straight shot like this is abolition. I mean, like when we think about summer 2020, the song that was the movement song was a song called Dior, which is based on a French luxury brand of clothing, right? And material goods, but it became part of a movement that created a synergy, or as I even talk about towards the end of the book, Romare Bearden's collection and his artwork, and particularly this one piece called The Block, which shows Black life, and it has no police in it. And I think that's really beautiful. And so we can kind of imagine these things because they've already been done. So that's why it's really good to look at our past to inform our present, to tell us where our future is going.
I think that's right, and you all have given us so many wonderful examples, wonderful texts. One text that I would just add to the mix. Sorry, y'all, I'm outside now.
You're doing the
One text
work.
that, for real. One text I would add to the mix is Instead of Prisons, which was written in the 70s by Quaker activists Faye Knopp and others. Which in some ways, for me, it was the most practical. Like, it answered my questions. It helped me imagine things. It confronted me with challenges that I hadn't thought of before, that I thought was incredibly important. So just something, just to add to the mix of all those other amazing books that you all put forward. I do believe that's another important text. And like y'all said, from films to music to text, there's just so many things that we need to be reading. I also add Soledad Brother to that mix. But let's just keep building, man. At the end of the day, this is an opportunity. This is a moment where the contradictions of capitalism, the urgency of the violence in the streets, the lack of solutions, the despair. I mean, we were seeing it in Palestine as well, where suddenly the conditions on the ground are forcing people to confront enduring truths and imagine new possibilities. And this is that moment for abolition. This is that moment for defunding. And this book is the text that will help us reimagine the world. It'll challenge us and force us to rethink what's possible. And the fact that you did it through dialogue. Now you're standing on the shoulders of Nikki Giovanni and James Baldwin. You're standing on the shoulders of Cornel West and Bell Hooks. You're standing on the shoulders of so many people who understood that dialogue isn't just a recap of what we know, but a form of inquiry. We are actually learning and investigating and unpacking the world. We are producing new knowledge through the dialogue. We are doing political education through the dialogue. We're doing political organizing through the dialogue. We're doing spiritual work, intellectual work, emotional work through the dialogue. And this book is that book. This is the text that is going to help us get to the next space. It is going to help anchor us and animate us toward a thicker, more ambitious vision of liberation. And so I encourage everybody to support this book, to support all the dope people who participated in the book, especially Zellie and Olayemi, and to support CJ for organizing all of this and for gifting us with such a fascinating and brilliant, provocative, inspirational, and in some ways confrontational text, because we need it. It's the perfect book for this moment.
Hey, we love that.
Thank you all for being here. Marc for hosting this, Ole, Zellie for for answering that call when I sent that however many years ago now to sit down and have a conversation with me. I appreciate Haymarket for giving me this opportunity and taking a chance on me. At the time, I was still, even though I had a book come out last year, I was still kind of an untested author at that point. So I appreciate them for giving me the opportunity. I also want to thank all of the people who gave blurbs to this book: Mark, Mumia Abu Jamal, Alex Vitale.
Free Mumia!
Yeah, free Mumia. If you don't know about Mumia, please go read about Mumia, and so many other people. And then I also just want to say thank you to my wife, to my family, to my network and friends who let me bounce these ideas off them and get the yay or nay if they think it's going in the right direction. It's always good to have that unfiltered group of folks that you can bounce ideas off of and have community. And so, as Zellie says, community is a verb. And so I hope we all have it, we all find it, we all keep it, and we all expand upon it. And so, yeah, thank you.
Thank you for letting us be a part of it, Calvin. This is amazing.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, brother.
Thank you.